They say the hardest part of a funeral is the final goodbye. But for me, it was hearing my husband's step-family discuss the division of his estate while his casket was still being lowered into the earth. Standing there, clutching a damp handkerchief, I could hear every venomous word slipping from Eleanor's perfectly painted lips, her voice a low, calculating hiss. Beside her stood Richard, his hands tucked casually into his pockets as if he were waiting for a business meeting to conclude rather than bidding farewell to his own stepbrother. Julian was a brilliant historical architect, a man who built legacies out of stone and memory, yet to these two predators, his life was nothing more than a portfolio of assets waiting to be liquidated. I stared at the mahogany wood of the casket, my heart hollowed out by a grief so heavy it felt physical. Julian had been my anchor, my gentle giant, and now he was gone, snatched away by a sudden, cruel heart attack that left me gasping for air. The cold reality of his absence was now crashing down on me, sharpened by the absolute lack of empathy from the people standing only feet away. Eleanor didn't even look at the grave. Her eyes were scanning the cemetery, calculating the net worth of the mourners, while Richard checked his gold watch with a sigh of sheer boredom. They had always treated Julian like an outsider, a stepping stone to the wealth they felt entitled to, and now that he was gone, they were ready to strip his legacy clean. The service ended, and the small crowd of colleagues and distant friends began to disperse, offering me polite, hollow condolences. Eleanor and Richard didn't even say goodbye. They simply walked away toward their sleek town car, already deep in conversation with a lawyer. I remained standing by the open grave, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, feeling utterly abandoned in a world that had suddenly lost all its color. That was when I felt a presence beside me, quiet and solid. I turned my head to find an elderly gentleman standing just a step away. He wore a heavy charcoal trench coat, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his eyes held a profound, sorrowful wisdom that instantly demanded respect. He looked like a man who belonged to another era, carrying himself with a quiet, dignified authority. Without speaking, he reached out and took my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm and warm. Before I could ask who he was, he pressed something cold, heavy, and metallic into my palm. It was an antique brass key, intricately carved with patterns that mirrored the historical ironwork Julian had loved so much. I stared down at it, my breath catching in my throat, as the stranger leaned in close, his voice a low, steady whisper that cut straight through the silence of my grief. "He wanted you to have this," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "Trust no one, Clara, especially not them." Before I could ask how he knew my name, or what the key unlocked, he let go of my hand, turned and walked away, his figure quickly dissolving into the thick fog. I stood frozen, my fingers tightly coiled around the cold brass of the key. The overwhelming, paralyzing sorrow that had weighed me down for days suddenly shifted, replaced by a sharp, electric jolt of adrenaline. My husband had not left me defenseless. This key was a message, a lifeline thrown from beyond the grave. Looking back toward the road where Eleanor and Richard's car was disappearing into the distance, a quiet, unbreakable resolve took root in my chest. The battle for Julian's legacy had just begun, and for the first time since his heart stopped beating, I knew I was not going to fight it alone. They did not even wait for the funeral flowers to wilt before they came to strip the flesh from my husband's legacy. The heavy oak front door of my home had barely clicked shut when it was violently thrown open again. Eleanor and Richard barged into the foyer, bringing with them the cold, sterile scent of expensive perfume and cheap ambition. Eleanor did not offer a word of comfort. She simply marched into the living room, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a steady countdown. Behind her came Richard, carrying a thick manila folder, his face twisted into a mask of manufactured concern that made my stomach turn. Richard tossed the folder onto the coffee table, right next to a framed photograph of Julian. He leaned forward, looking at me with a condescending pity meant to disarm me. He claimed Julian had been keeping secrets, that his brilliant architectural projects were nothing but a front for massive, catastrophic debt. He said the bank was preparing to foreclose on this house, Julian's ancestral home. Eleanor chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she told me they were only here to save me from bankruptcy. All I had to do was sign over the deed of the house to their holding company, and they would handle the rest. I stood perfectly still. My hand slipped deep into my coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the cold brass key. I looked at Eleanor, noting the frantic twitch in her left eyelid and the way her fingers clawed at her handbag. I looked at Richard, whose eyes kept darting toward the hallway leading to Julian's private study. My gut instinct screamed that they were lying. This was not a rescue mission. It was a hostile takeover. They were behaving like predators who smelled blood, but they had severely underestimated my resolve. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us until the tension in the room was thick. When I spoke, my voice was not that of a grieving, broken widow, but of a woman with an unshakable strength. I told them that I would not be signing anything today or any other day without my own legal counsel reviewing every page. Richard's face instantly darkened, the facade of concern evaporating to reveal the cold, calculating monster underneath. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening growl, warning me that I was making a grave mistake. I did not flinch. I simply pointed toward the door and told them to leave. They left, but not before Eleanor spat one last venomous warning, promising that they would take everything I had left. As the door slammed shut, the silence of the house rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The rhythmic, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo through the empty rooms, marking the passage of an invisible storm. I walked down the dim hallway to Julian's locked study, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. They had called his sudden death a heart attack. But looking at their desperate greed, a dark and terrifying thought took root in my mind. What if his sudden end carried a much darker truth? I approached his desk, ready to search for what this key was meant to open. Julian did not leave behind a simple will. He left me a battle plan disguised as art. Sitting at his mahogany desk, surrounded by the heavy scent of old paper, I refused to let the panic consume me. Eleanor and Richard wanted me to believe my husband was a failure, a man drowned in debt, but my gut instinct told me their desperation was the real story. They were terrified of what he had left behind, and they were frantic to find it before I did. I bypassed the filing cabinets containing his standard financial files, the ones Richard had so eagerly tried to manipulate, and went straight to the bottom drawer of his drafting table. There, hidden beneath rolls of blank vellum, lay his personal journals and the master blueprints for his final, crowning achievement, the St. Jude Restored Library. I unrolled the massive, heavy blueprints across the desk, weighing down the corners with his brass drafting tools. Julian was a meticulous man, a master of historical preservation who believed that every structure had a soul. As my eyes traced the intricate white lines of the library's cross-sections, a peculiar detail caught my attention. In the lower eastern wing, near the old archive vaults, there was a tiny hand-drawn symbol. It was a stylized, double-clover emblem, barely a millimeter wide, penciled in with his characteristic drafting lead. I flipped through his personal journals, and my pulse quickened. The symbol appeared repeatedly in his notes, always adjacent to structural voids that should not have existed according to standard building codes. Julian had designed a hidden compartment, a secret sanctuary within the very bones of the historic library. I remembered the feverish intensity of his final months. Julian had spent almost every night at St. Jude, coming home with limestone dust on his coat and a quiet determination in his eyes. When I asked him why he was working himself to exhaustion, he had taken my hands, looked deep into my eyes, and whispered that the greatest secrets are always preserved in stone, where the greedy never think to look. He told me that when the storm comes, the truth must have a fortress. At the time, I thought he was simply speaking of his love for architecture. Now, holding the heavy brass key the stranger had given me, the puzzle pieces fell into place. I held the key up to the desk lamp. The ornate, interlocking patterns on its bow perfectly matched the double clover symbol on the blueprints. This key was the only lockpick to his fortress. But retrieving the truth would not be simple. Walking to the window and parting the heavy velvet curtains, I looked down at the dark, quiet street. A black sedan was parked near the curb, its headlights extinguished. I knew who it belonged to. Richard's hired associates were watching my house, waiting for me to lead them to whatever Julian had hidden. They believed a grieving widow would be an easy target, fragile and easily broken. They underestimated my resolve. I let the curtain fall back, my mind turning cold and analytical. I grabbed my dark trench coat, slipped the heavy brass key into my inner pocket, and memorized the blueprint pathway. I was going to St. Jude tonight, stepping directly into the shadow of the storm to reclaim my husband's legacy. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, not from fear of being caught, but from the terrifying realization of what I was about to uncover. Slipping through the back kitchen door and bypassing the black sedan parked down the street, I felt the cold weight of the brass key pressed against my chest like a shield. I was a thief in the night, trespassing into the grand, silent halls of the St. Jude Library. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and cold stone. The towering shadows of the arched bookshelves stretched upward like Gothic sentinels, watching my every move as I navigated the darkness with only a small penlight and the blueprint etched into my mind. I moved with deliberate, silent steps, my boots making no sound on the worn marble floors. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. But I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. Following the eastern corridor, I bypassed the main reading rooms and slipped deep into the restricted historical archives. My flashlight beam danced across row after row of forgotten manuscripts until it finally rested on the private archive room at the very back. The door was unlocked, just as Julian's notes had suggested, left open for the ongoing restoration work. I stepped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing me in a tomb of dust and secrets. I directed the narrow beam of light toward the far wall, where the mahogany wood paneling was carved with the intricate patterns of Julian's ancestral family crest. There, nestled right at the center of the crest, was the double clover emblem. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached out to touch the cold, polished wood. I pressed firmly on the center of the clover, and with a soft, mechanical click, a hidden seam in the paneling popped open. Behind the false wood lay a heavy black iron safe waiting to be unlocked. I pulled the antique brass key from my pocket, its weight familiar and grounding. My palms were slick with cold sweat as I slid the key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly, a flawless union of design and purpose. I turned it, feeling the resistance give way. A heavy, metallic click echoed in the small room, a sound of absolute finality. The safe door swung open, revealing the dark truth my husband had sacrificed his peace to protect. Inside sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, a small digital voice recorder, and a dense legal dossier bound in black twine. I pulled them out, my hands shaking as I opened the dossier under the dim glow of my penlight. What I saw made the breath catch in my throat. It was not a record of Julian's debts, but a meticulous paper trail of systematic embezzlement. Eleanor and Richard had been quietly draining Julian's late father's trust fund, stealing millions while using forged signatures and shell companies to place the blame entirely on Julian. They had planned to bankrupt him, to ruin his name, and to leave me with nothing but his fabricated shame. Tears of hot anger and profound grief stung my eyes as I clutched the evidence to my chest. Julian had built this fortress of truth, and now he had handed me the weapon to destroy them. My hands shook so violently that it took me 3 attempts to press the play button on the digital voice recorder. Sitting in the suffocating darkness of the archive room, clutching the cold plastic device against my chest, I felt a devastating wave of longing. Then the silence was broken. My husband's voice filled the empty space, sounding so warm, so steady, and so agonizingly alive that I covered my mouth to stifle a sob. He spoke my name, Clara, with that gentle cadence that had always made me feel safe. He told me not to weep. His love remained as permanent as the ancient stone foundations he had built throughout his life. Julian explained that he had discovered Eleanor and Richard's systemic embezzlement months before his sudden passing. He found the discrepancies in the family trust, the forged signatures, and the paper trail of greed they thought was hidden. But his discovery made him a target. He knew they were planning to eliminate him, whether by forcing him into financial ruin or through more silent, sinister means. Under this immense stress, he quietly built a sanctuary of truth. He revealed that the stranger at the funeral was Arthur, his loyal personal attorney. Arthur was the only one who knew the full extent of the plan, a silent guardian waiting to deliver the brass key to my hands. The recording grew deeper, Julian's tone shifting from a loving husband to a master strategist. He explained the legal trap he had meticulously designed for his step-family. He had created a massive shell company, making it appear as though it held millions of dollars in secret offshore assets. In reality, this company was dummy-funded and buried under catastrophic legal liabilities and debt. Julian knew that Richard and Eleanor's insatiable greed would be their undoing. He knew they would stop at nothing to seize this company, believing they were stealing his hidden wealth. They had already threatened me, trying to force me to sign over our home, but Julian had set a far larger, completely inescapable stage. If they forced me to transfer his assets, or if they tried to seize the shell company, they would be signing their own destruction. The transfer documents would legally bind Eleanor and Richard to the immense liabilities of that shell company, while exposing their systematic fraud directly to federal prosecutors. The moment they put their signatures on those legal papers, they would walk willingly into a legal prison of their own making. Julian's voice carried a formidable authority, as he explained that their own blinding greed would be the hand that pulled the trigger, destroying their lives forever. The recording slowly faded into silence, leaving me alone once again in the quiet archives. But the crushing weight of my grief had completely transformed. In its place stood an absolute, icy clarity and an unbreakable strategic resolve. I looked down at the heavy ledger, the legal dossier, and the brass key in my palm. Julian had not left me defenseless to be torn apart by the hyenas. He had built a flawless, poetic masterpiece of absolute justice. I was no longer a grieving victim. I was the proud executor of his ultimate masterpiece, ready to watch their entire gilded cage crumble to dust. To catch a predator, you must first convince them that you are already bleeding. I stood in the quiet of Julian's study, staring at the telephone, my fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the cold, electric anticipation of what I was about to do. I had to become the fragile, broken widow they expected me to be. When I dialed Eleanor's number, I let my voice crack, infusing it with a carefully calibrated blend of exhaustion and desperate surrender. I told her I could not fight them anymore. that the threats and the imaginary debts were crushing me, and that I was ready to give them everything they wanted. All I asked for in return was to keep the roof over my head, the historic house where Julian and I had built our lives. The greed on the other end of the line was almost palpable. A sharp, collective intake of breath from Eleanor before she agreed to meet at Julian's former legal office. They wanted this done quickly, before I had time to find my footing or seek real legal counsel. They did not know that Arthur, Julian's trusted attorney, had already prepared the battlefield. The conference room was ready, the papers were laid out, and the stage was set for their final act of arrogance. When the heavy glass doors of the office opened, Eleanor and Richard strode in like conquerors claiming a fallen kingdom. Behind them walked their lead attorney, a slick, expensive man with a silver-plated briefcase and a patronizing smile. Richard did not even look at me. His eyes immediately darted to the legal documents resting on the center of the polished mahogany table. Eleanor, wrapped in a designer trench coat that smelled of expensive perfume and unearned victory, sat down opposite me. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning my tear-stained face and the damp handkerchief clutched tightly in my hands. She told me I was finally showing some sense, adding that Julian was always a dreamer who left nothing but ruin in his wake. I kept my eyes cast downward, letting a single, silent tear slip down my cheek. I swallowed my pride, forcing myself to nod weakly as Richard chuckled, muttering about how Julian's grand architectural legacy was nothing more than a house of cards. Their lawyer pushed the document toward me, pointing to the clauses that detailed the absolute transfer of all of Julian's corporate holdings, assets, and, crucially, every single associated liability. They believed they were stripping me of a secret fortune Julian had supposedly hidden within his shell companies. They had no idea that those companies were empty vessels loaded with catastrophic legal debts and systemic fraud that they were about to legally inherit. With a trembling hand, I signed my name on the line, playing the part of the defeated victim to perfection. Richard practically snatched the gold pen from my fingers, his face twisted in a smug grin of absolute triumph. He signed his name with a heavy, arrogant flourish, followed quickly by Eleanor, who practically purred as she scribbled her signature beside his. They believed they had won. They believed they had taken everything. I watched in absolute, icy silence as the ink dried on the page, knowing that the trap had just snapped shut. They had walked willingly into their own execution, and there was no turning back. The scratch of the gold pen had barely stopped echoing in the silent room when Richard let out a sharp, triumphant laugh, his fingers clutching the signed document as if it were a golden ticket. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and contempt, telling me that I had made the only sensible choice a weak, grieving woman could make. Eleanor smiled, a cold, predatory curve of her lips, as she slid the paper into her designer handbag, declaring that Julian's legacy was finally in their hands. They believed they had stripped me of my home, my husband's wealth, and my dignity. They believed they had won the final battle, but their victory lasted exactly 3 seconds. Before Richard could stand up, the heavy doors of the conference room swung open. Standing in the doorway was Arthur, the silver-haired gentleman from the funeral, flanked by 4 federal investigators. Richard's face flushed with rage as he demanded to know who had authorized this intrusion. Arthur stepped forward, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the formidable weight of a man who spent decades prosecuting corporate criminals. He announced that their reign of terror was officially over. Arthur explained that the documents they had just signed were not the deeds to Julian's hidden wealth. Instead, they had legally assumed full ownership of the fraudulent shell companies along with their catastrophic liabilities. More importantly, Arthur revealed that the transfer clauses they eagerly signed contained an explicit, binding acknowledgement of their systematic embezzlement against Julian's father's trust. By signing these papers to seize what they thought was a secret fortune, they had legally confessed to federal fraud. The color drained from Eleanor's face, turning her makeup into a chalky mask of absolute horror. Her handbag slipped from her lap, spilling its contents across the floor. Richard staggered back, desperately shouting at his lawyer to find a loophole. But the lawyer simply closed his briefcase and whispered that there was nothing he could do. They had walked into an airtight, inescapable prison of their own making. As the investigators stepped forward, the cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent office. I stood up slowly, looking into Eleanor's terrified eyes and Richard's defeated frame. I told them that Julian was indeed a dreamer, but he was also an architect who understood that a structure built on lies and greed would always collapse under its own weight. I told them that legacy is not measured in the assets you steal, but in the integrity of the life you build. Their own blinding greed had pulled the trigger on their destruction. They were led away in silence, leaving only Arthur and me in the room. I walked to the window, looking out over the city. The heavy gray clouds that had hung over my life since Julian's passing were finally parting, allowing the warm, golden sunlight to break through. I held the antique brass key in my palm, feeling its warmth. The storm had passed, the battle was won, and my husband's legacy was safe. I closed my eyes and smiled, knowing that Julian was finally at peace, and that I was ready to build a new future on the unbreakable foundation of his love.